Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to explore the awe-inspiring architecture, the incredibly fierce martial arts, and the unparalleled craftsmanship of ancient Sri Lanka. Honestly, if you've ever found yourself fascinated by lost technologies, legendary warriors, or just beautifully preserved historical artifacts, you are absolutely in for a treat today.
So let's just dive right into this with a really fascinating mystery. How do grand landscapes, deadly fighters, and a single museum artifact all weave together into one 1,500-year epic? It kind of sounds like the plot of an adventure movie, right? But this is the very real, deeply complex history of an island nation that managed to blend profound spiritual philosophy with some seriously formidable defensive capabilities.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. First, ancient fortresses and kingdoms. Second, Angampora, unarmed and deadly. Third, forging the Castana sword. And finally, treasures of the museum.
Okay, starting with Section 1, Ancient Fortresses and Kingdoms, a legacy written in stone and water.
We're looking at a progression of power here that spans literal millennia. Starting way back in the 4th century BC, we have Anuradhapura. Now, this wasn't just a basic settlement. It was a massively wealthy Buddhist center, and it maintained its power for 1,500 years. To put that into perspective, that is a staggering amount of time for any capital to thrive. From there, power shifted in the 11th century AD to Polonnaruwa. Built by King Parakramabahu I, this place became an absolute agricultural powerhouse. Folklore actually says their water management was so efficient that not a single drop of rainwater was wasted. And then finally, we moved to Kandy. This was the beautiful mountain capital surrounded by the Sea of Milk Lake, and it served as the very last stronghold of the Sinlasi kings until it fell in 1815.
But perhaps the most visceral example of ancient Sri Lankan engineering isn't a city at all, it's Sigiriya. Known as the Lion Rock, this 5th century citadel was built by King Kashyapa. It's this stunning blend of urban planning, hydraulic management, and natural harmony. People frequently call it the 8th wonder of the world. And when it came to security, well, they definitely weren't taking any chances. The exclusive western entrance for the royal family featured a drawbridge spanning an inner moat. When that bridge was pulled up, the citadel was protected by water, quite literally infested with alligators. No way you're sneaking past that.
Moving on to Section 2, Angampora, unarmed and deadly, the indigenous defenders of the island.
The martial art these indigenous defenders practiced is called Angampora, which essentially translates to unarmed combat. But it was so much more than just street brawling. It was a deeply spiritual, three-tiered martial art centered around Buddhist philosophy, primarily meant to disarm assailants. The first discipline, Angam, is unarmed combat that targets human pressure points to paralyze or even kill. The second, Ilangam, is all about armed combat. It involves mastering 21 indigenous weapons, a feat said to be basically impossible to perfect in a single lifetime. And finally, there's Maya Angam, which involves ancient incantations and spells of warfare. This is a discipline that's now largely lost to time, which is just wildly intriguing.
What's truly fascinating is just how formidable this martial art actually was. Passed down through generations of kings and warriors specifically to repel foreign invaders, it was incredibly effective. In fact, following the 1818 Uva-Walesa freedom fight, which was led by distinguished Angampora warriors, British Governor Robert Brownrigg strictly outlawed the lineages responsible for training the king's armies. This decree, and the actual document is still sitting in the National Archives in London today, triggered the rapid decline of this ancient art.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really fascinating transition in Sri Lankan history, moving from sheer martial prowess to exquisite, highly esteemed craftsmanship. Imagine being French traveler Pierre de Laval back in 1605. He was absolutely blown away by Sinhalese metallurgy. He noted how delicately they worked with gold, silver, iron, and steel. He explicitly points out that their fabricated arms, like arquebuses and swords, were elaborated, ornated, and considered by far the finest in the entire region.
Let's look closer at that with Section 3, Forging the Castana sword, the mystery behind the lion-headed hilt.
So there is an intense historical debate surrounding this sword's signature lion head design. It's a debate that really strikes at the heart of how history is claimed, touching on the deep tension between historical erasure and indigenous pride. On one side of the aisle, some historians argue for European influence, suggesting the design was modeled after the Dutch or Portuguese heraldic lion introduced during colonial encounters in the 16th century. But on the flip side, there is a very strong argument for indigenous roots. This theory posits that the design actually evolved from the Makara, which is a mythological Sinhalese water monster, combined with ancient local symbols, like that majestic lion of the 5th century Sigiriya rock we talked about a minute ago.
Now, the indigenous theory gains massive weight when you look at the historical timeline. In a decisive battle at Muliawela in 1559, Sinhalese warriors mounted a flanking attack that nearly annihilated Portuguese troops. Afterward, a 16-year-old prince, Takiri, gifted a Kastane sword to the Angam fighters, a 16-year-old kid, and that very sword actually survives today as a family heirloom. This strongly suggests the Kastane was a purely Sri Lankan invention, existing as a symbol of martial pride way before European aesthetic influence could have taken root in their weaponry.
Which brings us to our final segment, Section 4, Treasures of the Museum. Tangible anchors to the ancient world.
Established in 1877 under British Governor William Henry Gregory, the Colombo National Museum itself is an absolute masterpiece. Built on a former cinnamon plantation, the building features stunning Italian architectural elements. Think gigantic columns and gorgeous arches. But of course, it's what's inside that matters most. It houses a meticulously curated timeline of Sri Lanka's cultural evolution. We're talking well over 100,000 cultural artifacts, 4,000 palm leaf manuscripts, and countless pieces of art.
Among its mind-blowing items is this elephant lamp from the Polonnaruwa era. Now, this isn't just a neat piece of art, it is a literal masterclass in ancient hydraulic engineering. It features 2 men on an elephant's back, a beautifully ornamented arch, and a chain decorated with a female dancer and a cymbal player ending in a hooded cobra hook. But its true marvel is that it applies complex hydraulic science simply to regulate the flow of oil to a flame. It's a perfect encapsulation of art meeting advanced technology.
As you move through the galleries, you encounter objects that really spark the imagination. Take these 9th century Bodhisattva sandals, for example. They are massive, highly ornamented pieces of bronze footwear. The incredible thing here, they were unearthed completely without their wearer. Based on their enormous size, experts believe they belong to a 3-meter-tall standing Bodhisattva statue. That is a colossal, long-lost masterpiece of bronze art that is still missing to this very day.
On a more visceral and honestly sobering note, the museum also holds deeply personal artifacts from the fall of the Final Kingdom. You can see the Candy Queen's jacket worn during her capture in 1815. If you look closely, it bears a dark blood stain. Historical research revealed this stain occurred when local aristocrats who were colluding with the British violently ripped her earrings out during the capture. It's a tragic, highly tangible anchor to the brutal reality of the kingdom's ultimate collapse.
And then there is the royal throne of the Kandyan king. It's a gorgeous, ornate seat, crafted from jackfruit wood and covered in a gold-plated embossed metal casing. The British took it, but graciously returned it years later. Amazingly, in the 1950s, a random museum visitor actually breached the glass enclosure and hopped right into the throne. He refused to leave, claiming to the bewildered museum staff and police that he was the true king. It's a hilarious, slightly bizarre modern footnote to a highly revered historical artifact. You really can't make that stuff up.
Looking at all of this, the fortresses with alligator moats, a martial art that surgically targets human pressure points, and bronze lamps powered by complex hydraulic engineering, it leaves you with one compelling thought. If this is what we already know about, what other incredible secrets, lost technologies, and missing masterpieces are still buried out there in the Sri Lankan soil, just waiting to be unearthed? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I highly encourage you to keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.